Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. My name's Rob, and today we are joined by Andrew Guffey. He is the rector of St. Mary's in the Hills Episcopal Church, along with instructor in religious studies at Oakland University and University of Detroit Mercy. Dr. Guffey, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
First and foremost, how do you take your coffee?
I take my coffee today. I'm taking my coffee. It's a French roast from Trader Joe's. It's a very high caliber kind of coffee with a little bit of oat milk, creamer, and sweetener. But normally, my favorite is there's a little place in New York. There's a few different locations in New York of Joe Coffee, and they make the best latte I think I've ever had. And so when I've got the opportunity to get to New York, which I did in January, that's how I take my coffee. Yeah.
You don't do a Buddy the Elf where you just believe any sign that says they have the best coffee in the world?
I tried it once. It didn't work out.
Yes. So what's your story? You are both an academic and a priest, so give us a little bio of
Yeah.
how you are doing both.
So most of it got me in undergraduate, kind of all of it. I mean, I grew up in Iowa, small town in Iowa, among farmers, and so neither being a priest, because I grew up Methodist, so neither being a priest nor being an academic really were on my horizon. But went to undergraduate and caught the bug. I studied with a New Testament scholar, David Hay.
And where did
Uh,
you go to undergrad?
yeah, Co-College in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So very small, liberal arts college.
Is that
Um,
a private university or?
it is. It was Presbyterian in its founding, but it's since kind of wandered away from those roots, but is still a private school. But David Hay was a New Testament professor there, and he taught religious studies, and I was very interested in religious studies. I had started at the end of high school reading my King James Bible because I was into Bible study and things, and between the King James Bible and Shakespeare, I was having a lot of fun with the English language. So I went to college and decided I wanted to study religion and explore this further, as at the same time I was doing campus ministry and things and really wanting to enrich my faith. Uh,
What organization of campus ministry
yeah,
did
I ended
you
up
work
with
with?
InterVarsity for most of my college, well, really all my college days.
The big one. The big one.
Yeah, yeah. And they also encouraged, they have a great publishing wing, and so they also encouraged getting deeper, studying the scriptures intensely. And so both of them were going together quite well. And I remember in high school, I read this, not high school, college, I read this, a series of pieces in the Christian Century. I think it was, or was it Christianity Today? My goodness. I think it was Christian Century. Theologians and biblical scholars who were just kind of cresting at that moment. There was Richard Hayes and one of them was N.T. Wright. And I remember reading his interview, and he said, he addressed this like, what was it like to be a scholar and a priest? And he said, I sort of have one hand on the academy and one hand on the church, and then I'm at prayer at that point. And I remember thinking that sounded like what I wanted to do. And so that kind of led me to both. So went to college at Co-College, went and did my Master of Divinity then at Candler School of Theology at Emory University, where I got to study with Luke Timothy Johnson. He was my advisor down there. Well-known New Testament scholar, and very happy about that opportunity. Knew I wanted to go on and do PhD work, and at the same time, my ecclesial vocation wasn't exactly clear where I was going to end up. I was still nominally Methodist, but was not in an ordination process at the time. So I did not get into PhD programs that year, the year I graduated from Candler, but then I ended up doing a THM degree in New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary. And then I like to say I took 6 years off to get a degree in dealing with humans by waiting tables, and in Chicago and a few other places. And then I ended up in a PhD program at the University of Virginia, which treated me very well, where I studied Ancient Judaism and Ancient Christianity. Judaism and Christianity in Antiquity was the program. And so got a good grounding in both biblical studies and ancient Christianity as well as ancient Judaism. So and that led me, to teaching, but at the same time, I ended up kind of along the way was really attracted to the Catholic Church and to sacramentality. But a few things held me back from going full Rome, and so I ended up in the
Which
Episcopal Church.
yeah, which things?
Yeah,
Not that
good.
we have had Catholics on this program, so
Yeah,
we
yeah.
are not asking
No, no, no.
as a diss, but more of a inquisitive of you.
Sure, 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 sure. Yeah. I think the main one is the consolidation of power in the papacy, that I found disconcerting. And because I had studied so much of ancient Christianity, I was much more fond of a conciliar model. And so considered the Orthodox Church, but it was never going to work for me. Having been raised Methodist and then evangelical. But I ended up in the Episcopal Church, and then went through the ordination process as I was finishing working on my PhD as well. Went from Mister to Reverend Doctor in the space of about 2 weeks. And since then, it's been an interesting experiment because, as you might know, academic jobs are few and far between for tenure track. And so I've been very fortunate actually to have this kind of dual call. And so I get to do I get to be a priest and to do all of the rewarding work that comes with that. I get to teach and I get to continue to work on my scholarship, which not even all academics get to do that. So not such a bad thing. And that kind of brings us to the present.
Well, that is a great dovetail into a first real question: how has being a priest and an academic challenged your faith, if at all?
Especially early on in this whole intertwined path. I remember when I was at Candler and doing this critical biblical studies work. I have a friend who went to Yale Div, and he talks about John Collins, who would begin his course on with Genesis and would talk about Genesis. And what do we call a story with a talking snake? Well, I think we call it a fable, don't we? So there's something that didn't bother me too much because it's Genesis. I wasn't going to be too upset about Genesis. But the things that really pressed me were questions about the historical Jesus, questions about Jesus's resurrection, questions about Jesus's birth, and just the historical veracity of the Gospels. And slowly but surely, it was actually in some ways it was it was Paul and the liturgical elements of the church that really pulled me through that and the life of prayer. You sort of belong to two different worlds, and each of them thinks you belong to the other. And so, not necessarily a testing faith there, but there is also a difficulty in trying to make these two work together sometimes. That isn't exactly trying for faith, but it is trying of patience and of real world practical needs like a job.
What drew you then to the study of early Christianity? Was it because it kind of sounds like that was testing your faith and you wanted to just know more? It just something that excited you, or
Yeah,
something else?
yeah. Well, it all started with biblical studies because, I was in InterVarsity and was raised in it was Methodist church, but it was a fairly evangelical town. The big fish in my hometown was an evangelical free church. And so I knew that if you wanted to know more about Christianity, you want to know more about God, you read your Bible, you study your Bible. And so that's what I did. And the further into it I got, the more complex it got, but also the more fascinating. And so that really drew me in from the beginning, kind of through that angle. And I really got hooked on Revelation early too. That's something I haven't mentioned yet, I guess, is that my dissertation and good amount of my published work is on the book of Revelation. And that hooked me early too. I always people ask me about that sometimes. I say, well, go big or go home, I guess. So because the New Testament texts are so lively with and just kind of pouring out with this faith in Christ. but in so many different ways when you really get down to it, and with a lot of rough edges and a lot of complexity in it. And so I just wanted to know it more. I wanted to learn it better. I wanted to know it more. I wanted to understand. And that spiraled off into, okay, well, what came after the New Testament? And it backtracked all the way into the Old Testament as well. But that was kind of the impetus, I think. It was a both faith and intellectual curiosity. And I love a good puzzle.
So you've studied at Emory, Princeton, UVA. Have you met any academics that have fully denied Jesus of Nazareth did not exist as a human person? Like kind of getting to the Jesus mythicism that
Yeah.
is more prevalent online than my understanding for academia or just the
Yeah.
laity. But there seems to be almost every during the liturgical cycle of the calendar, it's like, did Jesus exist?
Yeah.
Did the nativity happen? You know, like, oh, we're asking big questions. You ask big questions like once a year. It's pretty normal actually. But what's the kind of historical Jesus sense in academia broadly?
Yeah. It's extraordinarily minimal in the academy itself.
By minimal, just in general, and have you actually met a
I've not
an
actually
act?
met one.
Okay,
No, I've never met anyone who's denied the existence of Jesus, not a legit scholar. I know they exist. Like I know Robert Price is out there, and the Historical Jesus Five Views, one of those Five Views books
yeah.
from InterVarsity.
Robert Price and Richard Carrier would be the two
Yep,
guys
yep,
with PhDs
yep,
in associated fields. But
yeah,
then you have like Biblical Archaeology Society that has thousands of members, and I don't think they've ever published an article
yeah.
by
The
them.
the closest, one of my good friends and colleagues is David Litwa. He has written a book where he talks about the Gospels as myth history. He's quite clear that what he's doing is not, for instance, what Richard Carrier is doing. Certainly there's myth is certainly a part of the discussion when you're talking about the historical Jesus, but the idea that Jesus himself is a myth. I will say the closest I probably came to actually meeting something like that was when I was at Emory. One of my Old Testament professors mused one time that he thought the passion narratives were probably a midrash on Psalm 22. Is in the direction of Jesus mythicism, but he wouldn't have said that Jesus didn't exist. He might have just said, but the shaping of the story is certainly not just a record of events. It's
But
so
but that's almost an admittance of the Gospels are theological history, right? They're not a
yes,
journalistic postmodern like these need to be the exact facts
right,
of everything.
right. No, and that's certainly what he would say. And that's what I mean, many, probably most scholars would say something like that, that the Gospels aren't innocently interested in history the way that we expect our historians to be today, but that they're all theologically motivated. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. It's
But
just
they
that, but they are
it,
shaped that way.
is that the also the semi-consensus in academia that they are roughly Greco-Roman biographies, but with a like theological twist or tinge or flair.
Yeah, I think that's still an open question. The question of the genre of the Gospels. There are still scholars, very fine scholars, Loveday Alexander and others who resist the the kind of reduction of the Gospels to the ancient bios genre. I think the thesis more or less holds up, but as with anything when you talk about genre, there are sort of exemplars, but there's no perfect example, right? They all resist to some extent. And I think the Gospels themselves are are unusual ancient biographies, if they are that. But that's probably about the closest analog that we've got. Yeah.
Yeah, anachronistic but useful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jesus is often presented in academia today as an apocalyptic prophet.
Yeah.
Do you think that's accurate? And even if it is accurate or somewhat, do you think Jesus was an archetypical apocalyptic prophet, or are there some things that set him apart, just like the Gospels are sure Greco-Roman biography, but also not really? Is
Yeah.
Jesus an archetypical prophet, or is he sort of that, but also not?
Well, he's unusual. To some extent, though, I'd say that all the apocalyptic prophets were unusual. I mean, they they stick out. That's why people remember them. And so Hanina Mendoza or Honi the Circle Drawer or Judas the Galilean or any of these figures that we know from Josephus or other sources, they all sort of stick out for their own reasons. That said, yeah, I mean, I think Dale Allison was right in his book Constructing Jesus. I think it was 2006 or something like that. He followed up on Albert Schweitzer's view that Jesus is an apocalyptic prophet. And all that really, I think we have to kind of, what do we mean by apocalyptic prophet? And Schweitzer thought that Jesus meant that the kingdom was coming soon and that he was actually wrong and was disappointed and crushed under the wheel of history, one of his famous lines. I don't think that has to be how we understand an apocalyptic prophet. Certainly, Jesus, I mean, all of the gospels say that Jesus's message was, the kingdom is near. And so if the reign of God is near, I mean, that's that's an eschatological claim. Now, what does the kingdom consist in? That's a whole other question. And what does that eschatology and that apocalypse, with that revelation of God's kingdom, look like? Unclear exactly how the expectation of the early church, for instance, matches that of Jesus. What did Jesus think he was ushering in, and what was it going to look like? Versus what did the early church take Jesus to mean? Because now those two are just kind of intertwined in our sources. Idea that we could pull out Jesus's ideas completely and Jesus's words from deeply ecclesial texts was always a bit of a fantasy, because Jesus is as Jesus was remembered. I mean, that's the only access we have to a historical Jesus at all, is how he's remembered in the sources. And so this has become a pretty common salutary advances in historical Jesus research, is the employment of this category of memory and thinking through how human memory works. And so Dale Allison, in Constructing Jesus, said, look, if we look at the sources, they all remember Jesus as a prophet, among other things, also a healer and teacher and things, but a prophet who announced God's coming reign, which is an apocalyptic prophet. And so if we can't trust them to remember that basic frame, then we really can't trust them to remember the minutia either. And he said, so our choice is really, if when we're talking about the historical Jesus, is not between an apocalyptic Jesus and some other kind of Jesus. It's between an apocalyptic Jesus and no Jesus at all. And I think he's right about that. I think historically speaking, we've definitely got an apocalyptic prophet in Jesus. But we can also then say, then again, history has its limits. It's limited and limiting. History can only talk about the things that are available to historical reasoning. A resurrection, for instance, is not something that gives itself easily to historical reasoning. We can say more about that in a second. So this is one way that Jesus's story is unusual, and breaks away from that just being a typical apocalyptic prophet, because he was remembered also as having been raised from the dead and now powerfully alive at God's right hand, which is, as I say, so this is not something subject to historical reasoning. When Ernst Troeltsch kind of became the granddaddy of how modern historiography works, one of the criteria was that this criterion of analogy. And if we don't have an if we don't have an analogous experience of something in the present, then we really can't talk about it as a historical reality, which is not to say that it's an unhistorical reality, but it just can't be addressed by history. And so a resurrection, for instance, can't really be called historical because it's kind of ahistorical, which doesn't make it unhistorical necessarily.
Just kind of within that framing or within that philosophical mindset of current history.
Right. And historiography, because historiography really is, as I tell my students this all the time, why do we study things historically? And the answer is it keeps us honest. And so the discipline of historiography is to not let our own, I think we're all well aware now that confirmation bias and the power of our own fantasies is strong. And so the work of history is like all critical scholarship, is to cut through some of those and say, okay, but really? And it's to keep us honest. And so so that's why when we get to something like the resurrection, I think we have to be honest and say, well, we can't call it historical exactly because we don't have a foundation for saying that in historical reasoning. For that, we do have to talk about theology and philosophy and metaphysics
And now, a word from today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is Robin Hurst of Fora Travel. Robin is a former winemaker here in Charlottesville and would like to take the stress out of planning and customize your next planned adventure. Robin is a top-notch, detail-oriented planner. Having personally traveled to 25 countries and 33 states, she believes in building balanced itineraries that blend luxury and relaxation with adventure and exploration. She wants to hear what you're looking for and offers customer care that is easy and special. Robin does not charge a booking fee for hotels, cruises, nor tours. She has a tiered pay scale that she works with clients depending on what they need. For more information about Robin, please see the details in our show notes. And now, back to the show. Give us a sketch of how the New Testament came to be collected before the Council of Rome. I say Council of Rome because Nicaea often gets theorized about in pop culture about how the Bible came to be, and I don't think Eusebius might be the only person we have notes from for that. I don't think the Bible's canonicity was ever talked about at Nicaea. I'm a very small synod, not a capital T traditional council, met in Rome and just kind of was like, oh, this is our list. Sure.
Yeah.
So what books were recognized early on as canon or as gospel, lower G gospel
Yeah.
for Christians?
Yeah, so obviously the place to start is that the earliest Christians were reading the Jewish scriptures. So it was the law and the prophets primarily, and the Psalms. The other writings not as clear, and those were all in scroll form too at the time. This is why I say they heard. I think it's easy to anachronistically think of, Christians walking around with a book, but
I
but
don't even
obviously,
think it was until like
yeah,
the later 19th century, especially from the Anglican literal press of getting King James out into literal hands of people. And literacy rates in 19th century is where they really take
right,
off. It's reading and writing for a long time was just for a few people because a lot of
right,
people just listened.
right. And but they would have mostly heard then the Jewish scriptures read. But then quickly, because you were asking about the New Testament, so a couple of developments happened early on, and some of it is almost accidental. I mean, if you look at the shape of the New Testament, we've got four Gospels, we've got this Acts of the Apostles, which sometimes falls right after the Gospels, sometimes in canon lists comes at the end, sometimes it shows up in different places. You've got a collection of letters of Paul or associated with Paul. And then you've got another collection of letters and miscellaneous writings that are sometimes called letters, like Hebrews or James. And then you've got this book of Revelation kind of tacked on at the end, or not, depending on the canon list that you're looking at. And so they're clearly in these chunks. I say it's kind of accidental because there's no reason that Paul's letters would necessarily have to be such a big part of the canon, but he ended up being such a big part of the New Testament canon. But those are kind of the elements, and both Paul's letter collection, as we more or less have it now, the pastoral epistles of First Timothy, Second Timothy, and Titus sometimes are included, sometimes are not early on. But by the end of the second century, it seems, there was a collection of Paul's letters and there was a collection of four Gospels. How those got collected in that particular way, who knows? It might have been that was a convenient length for a codex. And so it had something to do with the technological aspect of book production, but we don't really know. What we do know is that many of our early Christians identify these as canonical works, but they use them consistently in their theological writings. And so that seems to be kind of the earliest sort of coalescing. Now, why did they start coalescing like this? Why did they start getting collected? Unclear. I'm going to go out on a limb, give you what I think happened. I think the collection of Paul's letters, for instance, began early. In fact, with Paul himself, probably, that he had fair copies probably of the letters that he had written. If he didn't collect them, then his disciples did. and bundled them together. Some of the letters themselves actually indicate that they're meant to be read in many places. The churches to the churches of Galatia, the holy ones in Rome, like so these are this is there wasn't one church in Rome, there were several house churches, and so these were meant to be circulated. So I think Paul's letter collection probably is the first. And then a gospel collection. Why just these four? They seem to be the most prominent. I mean, it would be the easiest thing in the world for Mark to go missing. Because after you have Matthew and Luke, what's the purpose of Mark? It's fairly redundant at that point. But it didn't go missing, which makes me think that even probably by the end of the first century, these gospels were starting to circulate, or beginning of the second century rather, these gospels were probably beginning to circulate together, which is quite early also. And then they get stitched together, but we don't exactly know all of those processes. What we then rely on are canon lists, and those don't really show up until the fourth century. So there's a period of about 3 centuries where we don't really know exactly what the mechanisms were for deciding which books were read and which weren't, except for they were the ones that were most commonly in use for liturgical reading, which again probably goes back to something like Paul's letters were probably read out to the community during worship or around worship. And that becomes a tradition. You do it twice, it becomes holy tradition. So you got to keep doing it. And the Gospels were probably similar. These were narratives of Jesus's life that were convenient for reading and teaching the faith to people when they showed up. So those got collected. We have these canonical lists from the fourth century. Probably the most famous is Athanasius's list from 367, from his 39th Vestal letter, because it resembles very closely our New Testament, as we have it a little bit rearranged, but the same writings except for Revelation is not in there. And there are a few others from the fourth century. You're right about Nicaea, by the way. There was, and it's funny. That was one of the things that I really, when the Da Vinci Code came out, I was really disappointed. And people were like, "What do you like about it?" I was like, "It's just not believable as history." I mean, like, like they get the history wrong. So I don't. And this is a royal historian who gets it wrong. And he's like, Constantine created the canon. Like, no, no, he didn't. The Council of Rome was a small synod that was apparently convened sort of in response to an Eastern synod in 381 by Theodosius. But the list that's usually associated with it comes from the Decretum Galasianum, the Galasian decree, has been shown to probably date from about the sixth century, actually. And so the writings of the New Testament as we have them were more or less stable by the fourth century. But there was no real mechanism for closing that. And there was no closure in an ecumenical council. And this is going to be surprising, until Trent. And so, that was the first time that a declarative universal statement was made and by then it wasn't universal anymore because, you didn't have the Protestants. And practically speaking, what closed the canon for Protestants was the invention of mass-produced books. What's in the Bible? Well, whatever's in the book, right? And so the publishers actually had a big hand in closing the canon insofar as it got closed.
Whenever I'm talking to maybe atheist friends or agnostic friends, like, well, show me chapter and verse. And I always first think chapter and verse doesn't matter because chapter and verse are actually associated with printing. There was a
Yeah,
French printer in Paris who just was like, oh, I'm just going to divvy it up this way because it's easier for me to know how to print when I'm literally
yeah.
having chapters. There were chapters very
Mhm.
disorganized, both in the Hebrew tradition and in the Catholic tradition, but those were never set until this French printer was
Right.
just like, oh, I'm just going to make it up.
Yeah. It's kind of
So,
like BC and AD. Like AD wasn't used until what, the fifth century, I think,
mm,
and BC like wasn't in wide circulation until something like the 19th or 18th century.
yeah. And it's very interesting because not a lot of people know that the Quran probably from the beginning was organized chapter and verse. So it's
Yeah.
very different where it's like biblically chapter and verse is much later. You should be taking the entire book as it is.
And it's even then one of the things that then elides for us is we forget that it's a library and we tend to treat it as one book, but but it's not. And so it's an interesting project when people are like, what does the New Testament say about? And like, well, that's what, like asking, what does your public library say about X, Y, or Z? Like, sure, it's a little bit more coherent than your public library, but it's a library of works and not a single book. It's a book or it's a library around a pretty central theme. One of the things that people bring up sometimes are what was the role of, the Gnostics or Marcion or the Montanists in the development of the canon, and what were the criteria for canonicity early on? Why were some books retained and some books not? And I've sort of indicated like the books that were retained because they were authoritative because they came from Paul. They were stories about Jesus from some of his early followers. And so they were deemed to be reliable guides to the faith. That said, apostolicity was a pretty broad term. Like it didn't have to be apostolic in the sense of being authored by an apostle, as long as it represented well the apostolic faith, or what Irenaeus will later call the rule of faith. Inspiration was not a category that was talked about a whole lot early on, to be honest. It seems like probably the largest motivation for inclusion in the canon is just what was popularly used, what was widely and broadly in use. That those are the ones that ended up surviving. So, when people are like, well, they left out these books, like, well, they might not have left them out. They might just not have liked them, so they didn't read them. So, but as far as Marcion goes, he does seem to have formed his own canon, but it's unclear whether he's doing it in reaction to already canonizing effects or events in other Christian communities, or whether he is the impetus for that. There's probably a little back and forth there. The Montanists were big on prophecy, and so there's some speculation that written texts were being collected so that to minimize the effect of these prophetic voices that could lead people astray, false prophetic voices, as some would say.
There are books that aren't included. Many Protestants,
Yeah.
and just probably some Catholics even, but many Protestants just aren't aware of some of the books that were Christian but are not included. First Clement, Shepherd of Hermas. What are some of the books that were debated, or maybe not even were debated, but what are some of the early Christian writings that you think are still important for any Christian to read, and generally good for perhaps private reading and not
Hmm.
liturgical? Let me back up. I
Yeah.
cite those two because not only were they debated in one of the probable Constantine Bibles that he commissioned, one being Codex Vacantus or Sinaiticus, one of those two. We have First Clement and Shepherd of Hermas in that Bible.
Hmm.
So obviously they were, if they weren't canon, they were still obviously thought of by early and post-Nicene Christianity as very important.
Yeah. Yeah, the Shepherd in particular was very popular early on.
Which if you haven't read it, A, it's long, B, it's wild. It's
It is.
cool, but it's
It is.
wild.
It's one of the, and that's the, I think more or less we chose well in the end. That said, I think it for any Christian who's pretty well grounded, reading broadly and widely in early Christian literature is just an enjoyable ride, because you get a glimpse at the diversity of early Christianity and the depth and the intensity of of the thought and the creativity of the early Christians. The Shepherd being a clear example of that. I think the Didache is fascinating too, which begins with the two ways. There's the way of life and the way of death, and how to do that. But then also goes into talking about how to spot a good prophet from a bad one. If they stay 3 days, they're run them out of town because they're they're selling something. And so that's fascinating. I think all of them have their flaws too. Worth reading, but also saying that's their opinion. holding on to what is good, and then letting go of the things that are kind of, yeah, no thanks. So there's a lot of them. I think the Apostolic Fathers in general, which includes the letter to Diognetus and Clement and Ignatius, the letters of Ignatius are also fascinating, and a number of and Hermas as well, the shepherd as well. But yeah, I think there's a lot to explore and a lot worth reading that enrich your faith.
So you've already mentioned you did your PhD on the Apocalypse of John, Revelation. This is a wild book. I've taken some adjunct seminary classes, and the first one I took was actually on Book of Revelation as well. It was from Covenant Theological Seminary. It was
Mhm.
an 80 course, 3 hours each that had already been recorded, but it's drinking from a fire hose. But before we get into that, how similar is this book to other apocalyptic literature in Greco-Roman culture, Jewish theology, or even Gnostic philosophy? I know there's a lot of apocalyptic literature throughout
Yeah.
the millennia, but how similar is it to its own culture of the Mediterranean?
The apocalyptic tradition itself is a little funny that way because there are some sort of apocalyptic strains in Greek and Roman literature, certainly in Gnostic literature too. But the kind of Jewish apocalyptic tradition is itself sticks out, which is why it's identified as a tradition at all. It's a very scribal tradition. In a lot of ways, Revelation fits just fine. Actually, the interesting thing is that the genre gets its name from the Book of Revelation because it's the Apocalypse of John, and from that, scholars were looking at other works that looked kind of like that, and so they started calling them apocalyptic works. The irony then is that the Book of Revelation actually is not quite central to the genre as scholars usually see it. So they would point to something like, First Enoch or maybe Fourth Ezra or parts of Daniel as a more typical apocalypse, as a narrative story discloses divine truths, usually about the future or about a transcendent divine world. And in all of that, Revelation is doing exactly that. Yes, it's certainly revealing a divine world. Whether it's revealing a divine future is a questionable assertion that we'll come back to, I'm sure. So it fits pretty decently into that category of apocalyptic, except it calls itself a prophecy. And scholars have wanted to make a distinction between prophecy and apocalyptic that doesn't always hold. And it also has strong epistolary elements. And in that way, it does kind of stick out from the apocalyptic genre too, and looks a little bit more like Paul's letters. And so it distinguishes itself to some extent in that way as well. The other thing I think distinguishes it is even in apocalyptic works that look like it, like Second Baruch or Fourth Ezra, the proliferation of the imagery of the just kind of the bombardment with visual imagery in the Book of Revelation is just not scaled in any other work to the extent that it is in Revelation. The closest you get are like dream visions and reports of dream visions, but it's so extensive in Revelation that really does make it stick out a little bit. So it both fits and it's got its own contours, as one might expect.
You've already mentioned that this book was debated and sometimes even left out of canonicity lists for the New Testament. Why, in our best estimates, was it left off, debated? What makes it so revolutionary to be included in the canon?
Yeah, I think some people would say it's because a couple of different answers you'll find. One is as soon as Montanism hit in the second century and prophecy became dangerous, people were a little more wary of the Book of Revelation. Revelation was actually very popular very early on, as along with the Shepherd of Hermas. These apocalyptic works were fascinating, and so people kind of ate them up. And we know that from the relatively high number of early papyrus fragments that we have. But then it did fall out of favor for a little while, and some people think it was Montanism. Some people think that it was clearly anti-imperial, and therefore, when Christianity became imperial in the fourth century, the Book of Revelation became more suspect and was a little less a little too on the nose. And so, but I think honestly, the main reason that it was contested is what we've already said. It's wild. What do you do with this thing? So there's a in Eusebius, he's talking about Dionysius of Alexandria, and he's quoting from Dionysius of Alexandria, and he's talking about the book of Revelation, where he says, "Some indeed of those before our time rejected and altogether impugned the book, examining it chapter by chapter and declaring it to be unintelligible and illogical, and its title false, for they say it is not John's, no, nor yet an apocalypse, an unveiling, since it is veiled by its heavy, thick curtain of unintelligibility." I mean, I think that was the main beef, honestly, was they didn't know what to make of it. If you don't know what to make of it, it's sort of what Paul says about speaking in tongues, like much better if you can interpret. Tongues doesn't help anybody if nobody can understand what you're talking about. And I think the same was true of the book of Revelation. There were a number of, as there are still today, and God bless them, where we don't understand a word this is saying, so why do we even have it? And what would we lose if we got rid of it?
Speaking of that, obviously, in one title, it's called The Apocalypse of John. Is it by John the Apostle, or why not? And if
It's
not, and if not, which I assume you will say so, as actually I hold as well, why should we doubt its inclusion in the canon?
further down in Eusebius, actually, he quotes from Dionysius on this too, where he says, but there are so many different Johns. Oh yeah, that the writer of these words therefore was John, one must believe, since he says it. He said, I John, right? But what John is not clear. And so he goes through like five or six different possibilities of who John might be. And the answer is, we don't know. We don't know
Yeah,
who this John is. I
yeah, I
actually
think.
think,
Well, I
go
think
ahead.
that's the strongest case. Is our earliest document of this is like we don't know, and someone makes a comment where it's like First John and John the Gospel are good Greek. Whoever wrote Revelation
Yeah,
was not the same writer, simply because
yeah,
these two other authors who we ascribe to John the Apostle wrote really good Greek, or was clearly not could naturally write in the Greek. This person is not writing. This
yeah.
this person is not a natural Greek writer.
No, it's very different Greek. It's choppy. Got a number of grammatical errors, which, some scholars think are deliberate, but whatever. Austin Farrer argued that this may have been an early work of John's, and then John's Greek got better, which is possible. But I tend to think actually that it's pseudonymous, that it's written by someone under the name of John.
Well, and also John, very popular name. We have
Right,
multiple Johns already
right.
in Jesus's
And that's what most
apostles and
scholars would
disciples list.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what most scholars would say. Look, there's so many Johns. It's probably a John, but we don't know which one. I tend to think it's pseudonymous only because it is an apocalypse, and all of the other apocalypses are pseudonymous. They're all written under the name of some other figure. The apocalypse of Ezra, it's written under Ezra's name, Enoch, so forth. They're all written under the name of someone else.
Current scholarship, when I was doing,
Yeah,
it just describes it as John of Patmos
yeah,
because, right,
because we
like
don't know who else he was.
yeah,
And I just
just like John, we ascribe in an academic fashion first and second, or second and third John to John the Elder because he calls himself just John the Presbyter,
Yeah.
right?
And I think I, I'm just poking at that a little bit because we don't actually know his name was John. We know that there were works written under the name of others, and wasn't necessarily a deceptive move. Everybody knew that these apocalypses weren't really written by Enoch, and so forth. But that didn't make them less powerful. Now that does go to the other part of your question, though. So if this isn't written by John, the disciple, then should it be in the New Testament or not? And that takes us back to that canon discussion where apostolicity means a whole lot of different things. I think first of all, it just isn't it is in the canon, so we just got to deal with it. But if we're asking the question, how widely read should it be? It sort of depends on how we decide to read it,
Well, that
rather
that that
than
gets to my
yeah,
next question
you
is
go in
like,
there, okay.
yeah, if we are going to read this book, like I had read it once before I took a seminary class on it,
Mhm.
and the time I was in early high school and Left Behind was really popular. I was like, oh, this is so. I mean, it is a wild book. It's really fun to read because it's
Yeah.
just the imagery is striking and it's just like all sorts of stuff is happening and it's weird. It's wonderful. It's wild. But what are some helpful tips going
Yeah.
in besides the I think, very bad theology of Left Behind?
Yeah.
Should we take note of before even reading this book?
Don't get buried in the
Assuming,
details.
assuming, assuming, assuming people are not going to take a master's level course
Yeah.
on how to read this.
I think a few things. Don't get buried in the details on the first read, which is generally true of a lot of things, but that's where I think most of us get stuck when we read Revelation is like, well, what does that mean? What does that mean? And and I think that misses part of what the book of Revelation is doing. Remember, this was a book that was supposed to be heard and not necessarily read off the page. And when you hear it read aloud, it's actually a bit of a different experience. I did this with a couple of campus ministry groups once, and it's just a much different experience to hear it read out well rather than to read it off the page because you don't have time to like, well, what does that mean? Well, what does that mean? And that itself, that impulse to be like, well, let's decode this thing. I think that's a temptation that is probably inevitable, but which is best avoided if possible. So, what's the positive corollary to that? The Book of Revelation, as I said, bombards you with imagery, and a lot of the imagery is as you know, as Bishop Barron was pointing out, is drawn from the Old Testament, and he never quotes the Old Testament, depending on what you mean by a quote, I suppose, but alludes to it constantly. Don't expect to understand it all either. Is another thing that I would say going in. Like, they're just things that are going to go over your head, yeah, and that's okay. Like, it's okay to be unfamiliar with a work. But I think the Austin Farrer, I mentioned him before, he's a 20th century Anglican theologian and biblical scholar. And he said that the Apocalypse was the one great poem the first Christian age produced. I don't know if I'd call it a poem exactly, but that might set us in the right frame of mind for approaching the apocalypse. Rather than a map of history or a map of the future, or even really a map of the relationship between the Roman Empire and the early church, to read it as a work of the imagination. Now, whether that imagination is grounded in a spiritual reality or not, we can leave that open really for now. But if you want to believe it is, then that's fine. But to treat it first and foremost as a work of imagination, I think it pairs well with fantasy, right? Like fantasy works. Like I was thinking, once upon a time, I was watching a lot of Hayao Miyazaki movies, and I was like, oh God, this is all like really apocalyptic, and so it's a very similar sort of experience. It's almost a cinematic experience. And I think it should be approached that way to begin with. And then you can go back and you can ask your questions, get a good commentary. And a good commentary. Good commentaries are not always easy to find. So
What commentary would you recommend?
there
If
are a
there,
few. You know, Robin Whitaker, trying to see if I have it near at hand. I don't think I do. Robin Whitaker wrote a short guide in the was it the Bible for Everyone series? So I think it's the Book of Revelation for everyone. I think that's what it's called. No, that's not it. That's NT Wright. Revelation for Normal People is her little book, and that's a really good guide. Richard Bauckham has it's not a commentary, but his little book, The Theology of the Book of Revelation, is outstanding. Craig Kester, Koester, in the Anchor Yale series has a very good thick commentary. He's also got a couple of more entry-level books.
Left Behind's already been mentioned, is there any other bad theological takes at a popular level that you would like to dispose of real quick from Revelation?
Yeah, I mean I think the one thing that people really misread Revelation on is and have in the history of the church is the idea that the sort of spiritual warfare that we find in Revelation is authorizes or validates actual bloodletting. That there's a vindictiveness that if one isn't careful, one can easily slide into. And I say it's a misreading because if you read carefully, the saints never go to war in the book of Revelation. They're always the bystanders. It's Christ, it's the angelic powers. They go to war, but the saints never do. And so I think that is one danger of the book of Revelation is for those who are predisposed towards being encouraged towards violence, it can tend to exacerbate that. And I think that can be a real problem.
Let's say, for instance, let's just game out something
Hmm.
here. There are still lots of libraries in and around the Mediterranean that are still being uncovered, that's still being worked on.
Hmm.
Let's say that the lost Corinthian letters of Paul are discovered.
Hmm.
Would you, let's say they're verified, these are Paul, they are, or at least they're by a scribe that Paul used, obviously, for Corinthians, right? We do all the data analysis, and it's like the probability here is in the 90s
Hmm.
percent. Do you think that should be do you think those should be included in our canon? Do you think that should be an open discussion, or are we like, nope, canon's closed. These are great. They should be read for affection and they should be studied, but they're not part of the Bible.
I mean, I'd be open to either, honestly. I don't know if we have a mechanism anymore to make it happen because the canonical books are those that were in use most widely and over time, having been out of use for 2 millennia, makes it difficult to include them in the canon, whether we wanted to or not. What should they, and really the only practical question there for me would be, do we read them in worship and as Holy Writ? I don't know. I guess I'm inclined to say no, just based on the tradition of the church that if they were lost, there was probably they probably lost for a reason, but that would really depend what's in them, I guess. Like, if it's really amazing stuff, if it's Ephesians Redux, then that maybe
Yeah,
maybe it's worthwhile.
I say Corinthians because we know in First Corinthians Paul
Right.
references a previous letter, and then in Second Corinthians he references a previous letter that clearly isn't First Corinthians. So we're
Yeah.
obviously the apostles and disciples and Paul and all sorts of people wrote lots of Christian documents. We obviously we
Sure.
have like Polycarp wrote a bunch,
Yeah.
but
A letter to the Laodiceans that in Colossians mentions, and be lovely to
mm,
have that. Yeah, I think certainly I'd be giddy to see new documents, as any biblical scholar would.
yeah,
You
it's
know.
been I asked like it's been theorized that the Library of Herculaneum, one of
Hmm.
the other deeper site for Pompeii that was destroyed
Yeah.
has a huge library that we are still just slowly agonizingly working through and
Yeah, because
yeah, people are less theorized and more like, ooh, I wonder if there's like some Pauline
yeah.
letters in there.
Yeah.
So
Oh, it'd be juicy. Seems unlikely at this point, but it would be fun. And as a priest, I'm gonna say, if it enriches people's faith and draws them closer to God, then wonderful. If not, then
well, what's next for you? A book, an article you're working on, something you're
yeah,
excited about,
yeah. I've been
academically or within the liturgical space.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, plenty of church things that are exciting. These are interesting times to be living in and ministering in. But academically, I've been working on for a long time, slowly, a project on the Encratites, which is an early Christian ascetical sect. There really hasn't been a history written of Encratites, and in part that's because we find them first in Irenaeus. Irenaeus may have been passing on some hearsay. It's not at all clear to some scholars that a group called Encratites ever really existed. But I think we have enough evidence that they did. But they said, no meat, no wine, no marriage, basically. And so I don't know. I got really interested in them briefly when I was doing work on early Christian Apocrypha, and it just kind of stuck. And so I've been working on that and that's in some ways that's a boring project because it's kind of a history of a lesser known Christian movement. In some ways it's fascinating because I think this was an early Christian movement that wasn't really heretical per se. Like they didn't have outlandish beliefs. And that's one thing that I think the scholarship has gotten wrong on them over the years. They just were hardcore ascetics who thought they were kind of elitist, in other words. But so I'm working on that. But I'm also working on a book on Paul, tentatively titled The Apostles' Rules for Radicals, reading the Apostle Paul with Saul Alinsky. Just the insight is that Paul is a community organizer. That's a good analogy. It's anachronistic, but it's an analogy. That what he's doing mostly is trying to set up these eschatological communities. I've been wanting to return to an iconological commentary on the Book of Revelation, which is a commentary that looks at the imagery from a much more iconological meaning, studying the imagery as imagery rather than as a cipher for something else. I don't know, lots of things that I'm excited about working on.
Sounds like a true academic. You already have too many irons in the fire.
I have
You
so many
can't
irons
you
in
can't
the
can't. I love
fire.
them all. Why can't I just do
Yeah,
it all at once?
yeah, yeah. No, they're a little bit of a bottleneck at the moment. That's
You
right.
need to start working on theoretical physics so you can at least slow down time.
There you
If
go.
not, stop it so then you can work on all the stuff you want to work on.
Perfect.
Or jump to a multiverse where you've already finished it all and then you
There
can
we
just
go.
put it
There
back
we go.
together.
I just need the gauntlet, right? I just need the infinity gauntlet and I'm good.
All right. Well, with that amazing reference, Dr. Guffey, thank you so much for coming on. We'll link your socials and your academia.edu page and anything else below if you're interested in more of anything we've discussed today.
Awesome.
But Dr. Guffey, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.